will look like. After this welcome, we'll move on to our opening keynote address, and then move on to panel discussions and then workshops, followed by a brief break and pet happy hour, and then bite-sized SciPol pitches, more panel discussions, a healing practice, break, and then a networking happy hour and Sci Art night at the end of the evening. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Lara Pierpoint, and our moderator, Amrita Banerjee. Amrita is the inaugural national chair for NSPN and has been involved in NSPN since its inception in 2018. So thank you, Amrita, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Neil, for that introduction. And it's just to echo Neil, it's my pleasure to welcome the entire NSPN community to the 2021 symposium, and of course, extend a particularly warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. Lara Pierpoint. Lara will have the opportunity to introduce herself shortly, but in brief, Lara is passionate about technologies that meaningfully reduce carbon emissions and contribute to a cleaner environment. As Director of Climate at Actuate, she designs and runs programs that get emissions reducing technologies on the ground faster. So she is particularly well positioned to be our keynote speaker this afternoon. Lara has had a substantial career in both the private and public sector. She is a former AAAS Congressional Science and Engineering Fellow, where she served in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Lara received her PhD from MIT in engineering systems and holds dual degrees from the same institution in nuclear engineering and technology policy. So Lara, first of all, welcome to our keynote discussion. We're so glad to have you. I'll get right into the first question so you can introduce yourself further. Could you tell us a little bit about your career path and how you arrived at your current position?
Sure, happy to do that, Amrita. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you, though, to you and to NSPN for having me here today. I'm really excited to be having this conversation, especially with this group of people. I think all of you who are here today, all of you who are taking part in this symposium, it's such a great show of strength around, people who really care about policy and people who really want to solve problems. And I think sometimes we lose sight of how rare that is. There actually are, to be able to actually be in community with a group of people who really share a passion for creating real change and doing it through policy is so awesome. So I'm really honored to be here. But to your question, so my career, I love to make the joke that you can kind of tell by the stages of my career that I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. So I've started off, obviously spent a lot of time in academia working on my PhD and a little bit of time as a postdoc, looking at loan guarantees actually and how well they supported energy innovation. And then I went into the government and was really excited to be a Congressional Science and Engineering Fellow, and then spent some time at DOE, where I led an office focused on analysis and policy for big baseload power and did a little bit of grid cybersecurity work. And then I went into the private sector and had a job at a corporation at Exelon, which is one of the biggest electric utilities in the United States, and has the biggest nuclear fleet in addition to 6 regulated utilities with sort of a wires and delivery business. And then from there, I came to a nonprofit, and that's where I am now, in the belly of the beast, trying to figure out what I can do to really have, really help the whole ecosystem have bigger impact and get much faster to greenhouse gas reducing infrastructure that's actually deployed at scale.
Fantastic. And just to pick on the last part of your response, could you tell us a little bit about Actuate and the mission of this organization and your role in the climate conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, the theme of my career has been that I've always been chasing impact. I've always been trying to figure out how can I do the most good for the planet and for the climate. And so that's why I was thinking policy. And then I really wanted to be at an electric utility where decisions get made about installed infrastructure. And part of what I've learned about the climate technology ecosystem is that it's really hard, obviously, and it takes a lot of time to get the technologies from inception, in a lab all the way to where they're actually making a difference at scale for the climate. And I think there's some really good news stories here. A lot of new things have come into existence in the last couple of years. really the last decade or so, that really help get climate technologies across valleys of death, really get them to where they need to go. So for example, we have, venture capitalists with much longer mindsets, who are willing to really take some big risks and wait a little bit longer for the results. And they're actually investing in climate tech now, and to a degree that they hadn't before. We've now got a whole class of thing called a hard tech incubator. So like MIT's Engine and a number of other organizations like that are willing to really spend resources to help get these technologies going. National Entrepreneurial Fellowships like Actuate. And a lot of these things, are really helping, particularly at some of the earlier stages of the pipeline. That still, one of the things that has frustrated me, and I think a lot of us, is that we're not getting enough points on the board. We really, need to see that curve bend really dramatically when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And so there's more we need to do to get things really across the finish line at that gigaton scale where it really starts making a difference on that graph. And it gets messy, especially when you're talking about the later stages of this pipeline. There are a lot of different variables. You're talking about markets, financial systems, policy, a lot of things that have to go right at the same time in order for technologies to make a difference. So that's really what I'm focused on at Actuate, is what can we do at kind of that systems level to really change the playing field entirely for whole classes of technologies. Part of what we see is that we've got an innovation ecosystem that works. And so if you look at the story of solar, that's a really great example where, we invented solar panels, and then eventually through innovations, obviously in the technology itself, but also very importantly in business models and policies and different market structures and ways of financing, we've gotten to the point where solar is really poised to make a big difference. But if you think about it, we invented the first solar panel in 1954. And so here we are 70 years later. And right now, solar is producing a little bit over 2% of the electricity in the United States. Again, poised to do a lot more. It's a really good news story, but we don't have 70 years to wait for all of the other technologies to do the same thing. So that's what we're trying to do at Actuate, is come up with a series of programs, do some innovation in that systems world itself, maybe test a whole bunch of business models against one another, maybe try to prototype a system for doing new kinds of transactions that can really enable a new market for something like carbon dioxide removal. Those kinds of things are the sorts of things we want to push on to make that 70 years much shorter and make it more meaningful for the climate.
That's so fantastic, so inspiring, and we're definitely going to follow up on some of the things that you just pointed out there. To stay on the theme of your career, however, you've got this experience in academia, government, the corporate sector, philanthropy. Could you share with the audience a little bit about how it's been navigating these different environments, the transitions between these sectors? What have you learned? What can you tell us?
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, there are obviously a lot of things that are very similar about all of these. So I would say that, the first thing I say is that what makes a job wonderful is the people that you work with and the mission that you have. And so I think that's one thing that's really struck me, is that despite all of the big differences in those environments, I've been so lucky that that's really, been a constant, is that, as things have changed and as I've had different goals, I've been able to work with people I really respected. And so that's just been huge. So I would say always chase that to everybody. Obviously, there are some differences. I will say that when it comes to, for example, access to IT support, nothing beats the private sector. Let's just be honest about that. But, all joking aside, I think, there are some really big advantages and disadvantages. I think another big difference actually is sort of the bottom line of what it is that you're working on. And so, for example, when you're doing policy, one of my favorite things about that is your bottom line is the welfare of the people of the United States. Like, how cool is that? That's what you're really, striving for all the time. And not that it's not cool to be in the private sector where shareholder value is a piece of what you're targeting, in part because if you're thinking with that mindset, if you're thinking with sort of a business mindset, your opportunities to really make big differences actually sometimes get a little bit bigger, because if you can come up with those, those ideas where there's really a way to make a lot of money quickly and to kind of, leverage some of what exists within capitalism to get to a big solution, that's a way to move the needle really quickly. So just some really interesting differences in those kinds of ways. One other thing I would say is that, navigating from one thing to another is not always straightforward. I think, particularly jumping from the policy environment into the private sector, I thought would be a really easy thing to do, but it turns out that, it's not. It depends on kind of what you want to do and how your connections are set up. And one thing I would just say to everybody is that, if that's something that you want to do, to kind of learn from what happens in the private sector, and I would definitely encourage that, especially if you want to have a long career in policy, having that perspective on what actually happens on the private sector side, I think is really important. Just make sure that you take your time and that you really get to know the kinds of companies and people, the places that you want to go, and understand that one of the things, for example, that really doesn't translate is going to be your job title. So for example, we have principal deputy assistant secretaries at the Department of Energy, and that's a really amazing job description. No one from the private sector has any idea what that is. So, so just understanding that, the translation doesn't always quite work the way you might expect, but I think there's some really important and awesome things to learn by having the different kinds of perspectives you gain from being in different places.
Yeah, that's absolutely so true. And your point about messaging yourself and your own brand, I think is well taken. So one of the questions we got from the audience, as you can imagine, there's a lot of interest in the AAAS Fellowship in this audience. Could you talk a little bit about what you gained in that fellowship? How has that helped in your career today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the AAAS Fellowship is just an awesome thing to do. I think anybody who has an opportunity, just go for it. I think the first and most wonderful thing about AAAS is the network of fellows that exists within the Washington, D.C. area. It's really amazing how many people there are and how passionate and committed they are. And to have that kind of community that not only offers that, but also offers the perspective that I know is near and dear to the heart of everyone here, which is how do you bring evidence and science and real sort of truth to these conversations and policy, but also respect and understand that that's not the only conversation you need to have when you're trying to push policy forward, right? That there are a lot of other considerations. And so having that kind of really huge network of people with a vast array of experiences and ideas on successes and failures and how to navigate in the policy world, I think is extraordinarily valuable. But there's a lot that I learned too. I think, one thing was some humility, honestly. I think there was a part of me that somehow had this idea that as a AAAS fellow, here I was bringing the scientific expertise. I knew that everybody who, was working on the Hill was just completely, flat out all the time, working unbelievably hard, understaffed, overworked. And so I figured I was going to be this knight in shining armor coming in with all this information and extra capacity, and it was just going to be awesome. And I learned that that's not exactly how it went, right? That there's a really complex set of relationships and ways in which people operate, particularly when the moments and the opportunities come to do something big. And so it was really important to do a lot of learning and listening and to really absorb how that system worked and figure out, how to work effectively and how to be effective and how to really respect all of the knowledge that existed and the different kind of knowledge that I brought to the table. And I think, once I slowed down and understood that, I think, particularly doing a congressional fellowship, I will always say to people, there is no possible way to learn how Congress works other than by being at Congress. Conversely, it's also true that once you learn how Congress works, a lot of that doesn't necessarily apply in any other setting. It's its own separate beast. But again, clearly, if you're going to do policy, I think it's a really great step and a really good thing to do within your career to really just be able to absorb how that particular body operates.
Fantastic. I think you've touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to give you the chance to kind of explicitly say any more. Again, the audience contains so many graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, early career professionals. Is there anything else you wish you had known or better understood at that stage that they can put in their back pocket?
Yeah, you want to know, honestly, the main thing that I wish I had been different is I wish I had been able to sit back and enjoy it a little bit more. I think for me, I've always been so hungry for impact and so hungry for moving and going and doing. And I've been really impatient, I think, a lot of times in my career. And now looking back, I'm like, wow, I was able to learn and do some really cool things. And I think, understanding too that there are seasons to your career, that there are times when you probably can have a really big impact and times when it's also okay to say, maybe I'm in a more learning moment right now. Maybe there isn't exactly an opportunity to seize the thing or do the exact thing I'm really hoping to do, but to ask yourself, what can you take from the experience and can you give yourself some grace as you're growing and learning and getting to places where you can have impact?
Fantastic. That's so true. So you talk about the impact, you talk about the urgency of the climate moment, and a lot of the conversation that we hear is very rightly about what's going wrong in tackling climate change or what's not being done. So I wanted to give you the chance to reflect on what's going right. What are some successes that we should highlight and celebrate as we face this global crisis?
Yeah, you're right. I think this is so important, is to find those moments of positivity and those things that you can seize on to say, yes, this is what we need more of. And the good news is I think there's actually a lot of that. So when you look at, for example, what happened in Glasgow, I think, there were certainly some big disappointments, but there were also some big, really awesome surprises. So this methane pledge to reduce methane emissions globally by 30%, that is a huge deal. So is the fact that there's an agreement, sort of special kind of cooperation agreement between the US and China. And obviously there are a lot of details to be worked out in both of these arenas, but I think there were some really important decisions that came out of this, and we should absolutely celebrate those. I think the other thing that we saw at Glasgow and are also seeing more generally right now is honestly a sense of urgency around solving climate change that I have never seen in my career. Now, granted, I wish this had been there 15 years ago, but I'm really glad it's here now. I mean, the fact that we're having these conversations at a fever pitch, and one of the things that you and I talked about is how surprised I've been. I thought in March 2020, okay, we're entering into a pandemic. And I really thought that the global conversation was going to be all health all the time for some very obvious and very good reasons. And one of the things that really surprised me as we got into some of the deep, dark days of the pandemic was the degree to which the news coverage still was talking about climate change. And there was still a lot of information and still a lot of discussion and still, frankly, a lot of movement. Obviously things slowed down because everything slowed down, but not to a complete halt. The climate community was still pushing everywhere it possibly could and has really gotten ramped up again to a really rapid pace of action. And that really, I think, speaks to the way in which the whole world is starting to understand that this is a huge problem. It's not something we can ignore. It's coming at us, the impacts of climate change faster than we can think. And while all of that is really challenging us, I think it's really galvanizing a lot of really important action, a lot of really important individual questioning of what can I do individually to make a difference. Another thing that I think is a huge positive is when you look at the range of corporate commitments that are coming out related to greenhouse gas mitigation and climate change, it's really stunning. Again, a lot of things need to happen to make those a little bit more real, a little bit more science-based, but there are resources that are gathering to start to do this. You're seeing, for example, the car companies and their commitments to including electric vehicles, I think is really, we need to do more. We need to go faster, but the fact that corporations are not waiting to be regulated and forced into doing a lot of this stuff, they're seeing that there's a desire on the part of everyone in the world to make a difference. And they know that their products and their services need to take that into account. So I think some really positive waves of momentum that are really going to make a huge difference, particularly in the next couple of years. So it's a really exciting time to be working on climate mitigation and climate technology.
That is so true. And as you so presently pointed out, these are conversations around the climate that are not happening in a vacuum. We are still in the midst of a global pandemic. And there are so many factors to consider when you think about tangible solutions, and your work is all about tangible solutions. So could you talk a little bit more about examples in your work of formulating actionable strategies to address our changing climate?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important thing. So I talked a little bit at the beginning about system.
Yeah.
In that context, it was kind of about, what is the system around getting a particular climate technology where we need to go. But one of the things that we're also paying attention to within Actuate is kind of the bigger question around systems, because obviously, as you just said, we don't make decisions, we don't change, our climate related infrastructure in a vacuum. There's a lot that's already on the ground, and there's a lot we have to consider, including people and their livelihoods and things like that. So to give one example, one of the things that we've been thinking about and working on within Actuate is potentially how do we help stop deforestation. And originally I was thinking, okay, maybe there's like a measurement and verification angle, how do we make sure that we know how much carbon there is in forests and whether forests are standing or not and those sorts of things. And there's some really great work and some interesting startups that are trying to solve those kinds of challenges. But as I kept digging, I realized, this isn't really necessarily the problem, is just being able to understand what the carbon content of a forest is. Really, when you think about how to stop deforestation at scale, this is an economic picture. And what's actually happening, I was really struck by this one quote that I read that basically said, with one hand, the developed world is spending, a tiny amount of money on forest related offsets. And with the other hand, we're spending billions of dollars on things like beef and palm oil that are the entire reason that this deforestation and this destruction is happening. And so when you really start picturing it that way and thinking about the fact that there are real people with real livelihoods that need to feed their families, and that there's this really important dynamic around, indigenous populations and understanding what are the needs of humanity in addition to what are the needs of the climate. And then you start to realize that this is a lot about governmental structures. So as much as you might want to spend money, keeping a forest standing in one location, there are big questions around, do the governments have the ability and the willpower to make sure that that doesn't mean that another forest is just going to be cut down somewhere else? So a lot of really important and really challenging things to work on there. But that's one reason that, now instead of focusing kind of directly on deforestation, we're starting to think about a couple of things. One is, can you reduce emissions from cattle and ideally kind of find a way to, back off on the amount of consumption we have there? But also think about ways to provide a different kind of resource, a different kind of economy that might make sense for people. And one of the things that's really intriguing me right now is the use of mass timber in building structures. So this is sort of an interesting win-win, where if we think about actually using timber to replace cement and steel in buildings, then the embodied carbon of that building really drops, and we're reducing emissions from the steel and cement sectors. But you also start to think about forests now as a resource, and maybe as a potentially very valuable global resource. And this obviously is not perfect. Most of the time we're talking about, sort of northern forest hardwoods when we talk about mass timber, but it turns out bamboo is also a great way to go. So are there ways that we can think about developing more sustainable, economically valuable opportunities in countries that really allow for a different approach that then can start to shift the whole economic balance away from deforestation? That's one way to think about this at scale. A lot of questions, obviously, about how we do this. We're fairly early in our journey, but we're trying to be really deliberate about mapping the barriers and being clear about what are kind of the big drivers of change here and how can we try to get those moving more quickly.
Absolutely. And when you talk about these technologies, when you talk about these actionable strategies, I know that you mentioned indigenous populations. Could you share a little insight on how you're thinking intentionally about making sure that marginalized voices are being heard? Because of course, there's such a long history behind certain populations being cut out of that conversation. So could you share what your thoughts are on these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me start by saying that, I am still early in my journey. And so I have a lot of listening and a lot of learning to do, and certainly invite that if anyone has comments or questions or resources to send my way, I am at a moment and will be forever where I am all ears on those things. So, there's a lot that we're thinking about. One thing that I will share is that I think, part of what I'm noticing about the conversation around equity and justice and climate is that there's a lot right now looking at the consequences of climate change and how that's disproportionately affecting a lot of marginalized people. There's also a lot of conversation about what it means to build new infrastructure and how to do that in a way that supports communities instead of assuming that you're going to build the things that no one wants in the places that affect the poorest people. So I think that's extraordinarily important work, and that's part of what we're thinking about in the context of our individual programs is as we're moving forward with these different kinds of solutions, how do we both meaningfully include those voices, the voices of people who have been affected by these kinds of issues, and how do we make sure that we are hearing them and moving forward in ways that are going to be supportive and build up their communities instead of doing the opposite. I think that's a really key sort of near-term piece of what we're doing. But there's also kind of a long-term piece of this that I'm thinking about too. So within Actuate, we both are wanting to run these programs that we hope are going to meaningfully accelerate greenhouse gas emissions reduction. We have this very near-term goal to try to make sure that we're doing really important things for the climate. We actually also have a long-term goal, which is that we're trying to show kind of a different form of innovation that exists at the systems level and really targets not just technologies, but the entire system. And I think in that vein, one of the things that I've noticed is how it seems to me that the climate tech innovation ecosystem is not necessarily built in a way that serves, particularly, again, marginalized people. And one example of that is that you see that for a lot of technology companies, the incentive is very strong to start by going after early adopters and then create a solution that trickles down to the mass market eventually. And this is a pretty common playbook. And one example is with electric vehicles. You've got, the high-end Teslas, and now we're starting to see this move into the rest of the world. But there are some big problems with that as an approach. So usually when you talk about early adopters, that's a coded word for people who are very wealthy, who have the kinds of resources to try something new, who are able to take risks on something that's a little bit different. And the solution that works for them might not be the solution that works for everyone. And electric vehicles and charging actually presents a pretty good example of that, where right now we're assuming a lot of people will charge at home. Well, it turns out that somewhere around 50% of cars in the United States don't have dedicated parking spaces. So this isn't a solution that works for everybody, to assume that at-home charging is going to work. And so that's something that we're explicitly thinking about here at Actuate. But, again, I think the broader point is to really figure out, is there a different way to do innovation that actually brings these equity concerns in from the very beginning and really finds a way to do technology design that is inclusive from the start? And the interesting thing about the climate world is that this isn't just the right thing to do, but I actually think it's necessary, because we have to reach scale quickly with everything we do. And the only way we're going to do that is by being very thoughtful about the very big solution from the beginning. So again, really invite lots of comments, lots of work to do to operationalize this in a way that's meaningful to the people that actually need to, that are actually affected by all of this. But these are some of the things that are on my mind currently.
Wonderful. And when you think about, innovation, inclusive design, I think there's certainly an appreciation in this community that there is and will be resistance to developing, like you said, these big changes that have the ability to scale and tackle the issue meaningfully. So can you share some advice that you have for researchers, for science policy professionals, for folks in this audience, on how you remain engaged and enthusiastic in the face of this kind of resistance?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely resistance out there, but there are a couple of things I would say about people who are resistant. And I think now we're moving less to, let me say this, there's good resistance. There's the kind of resistance that says, I'm representing my community, and you need to go slowly, and we need to understand how to move forward together in order to come up with a solution that is actually going to be sustainable in the long term, because not only does it serve the climate, but it also matches the other interests that are extraordinarily important around economics and livelihoods and things like that. So I think we're not talking about that now. If we're talking about, say, climate deniers, that's a little bit of a different situation. I think the first thing I would say is that everything changes, which is a good thing. So right now there are climate skeptics and climate deniers out there, but one of the things that has fascinated me is the difference between how the political conversation is now versus even when I was in Congress, I guess about a decade ago. And so when I was in Congress, I was coming in, at a time, it was right after this infamous moment where James Inhofe, the senator from Oklahoma, in the middle of a DC snowstorm, came down to the Senate floor with a snowball, threw it across the Senate floor and said, climate change is a hoax. So that was where we were then. Now I'm hearing a lot less of this climate change is a hoax kind of language. What you hear more of is now this refrain that, okay, maybe climate change is happening, but we're going to innovate our way out of it. We don't need to try to restrict our economic activity in any way. And so I think it can be hard to hear when you hear that as kind of limiting your options and your action. And it certainly is, and willingness to pay, all of this, these create some really big barriers. But again, one of the things that we're trying to do is to think about, are there ways through all of this? Are there ways to actually kind of bring, multiple people on side for something? So I'll give one quick example. The fossil industry is obviously a big challenge here. But one of the things we're thinking about is how there are all these fossil assets that exist out there. Financially, it's a huge hit to imagine that we actually stop production of oil and gas and coal, with any sort of immediacy. But how can you alleviate that? Is there a way to actually transition away from using those assets to maybe soften the financial blow to an extent that means that instead of sort of greenwashing a portfolio by selling a fossil fuel asset to someone else who's going to, operate it even less sustainably, you actually have incentives to close that down? Are there ways that we can sort of work with companies to come up with solutions like that are going to get us where we need to go much faster? So that's what I would say. Definitely there's resistance out there. It can get really frustrating, but keep those things in mind. One is that it will change, maybe in ways you don't expect. And also, keep looking for those opportunities where you can find a path through.
Yeah. And speaking of that path through, we've discussed some of the leaps you've taken within your career to have that high impact. And I think that's something that a lot of folks share, whether or not they're in the climate space. So what should other young professionals kind of carry with them when thinking about their own career and how to maximize that personal and professional high impact?
Yeah, I think, I've said some of these things, but I would say one important thing is really to swim downstream, look for opportunities that are going to work, and keep your eyes open for opportunities where you can have impact. But definitely, look for places where your skill set that you build naturally matches some sort of big opportunity, because I think those are some of the most interesting places to grow and to be able to actually have real impact. The other thing I would say is go for breadth. I think, and as scientists, we're all trained very deeply in something, obviously, and that's definitely the way that science works. And I think having the ability to think that way and do that is hugely important. But it's also important to really break out of your silos. And that's part of why I said at the beginning, if you're deeply committed to a career in policy, spend some time outside policy. Make sure that you really get a sense for how things work in the corporate world. Learn about startups, go spend some time in the nonprofit sector, spend some time with community organizations, do the kind of learning that is going to make you really effective so that you'll know what works and what doesn't from a policy perspective. Because I think, honestly, that's what the climate challenge is calling for right now, are more people who see the big picture and you can really kind of translate across all these silos, because it's becoming increasingly clear there's no silver bullet policy, there's no silver bullet technology, there's not a silver bullet anything. This is about massive economic and infrastructural shifts. And it's going to require literally everything we've got. And so the more people who can work across that big picture, I think the better off we're going to be.
That's fantastic. I think you preempted the question in the Q&A that's really talking about, what kind of, beyond the niche expertise that so many of us develop in grad school, how can we broaden our experience? And so you talked about, finding those opportunities, expanding your horizon. So that's really fantastic. Mm-hmm. You've been in the climate sector now for a while. What are you kind of hoping to see as the conversation shifts, as politicians, as you said, come to really appreciate the challenge ahead of us, the public, etc.? What are you hoping to see in that sector going forward that's going to keep you engaged and keep you optimistic about the path ahead of us?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what I'm hoping to see, and happily, I think I'm already starting to see glimmers of, are more entities and people within the system who kind of understand the bigger picture. I think there was a lot, it sort of has seemed, I think, over the course of my career, like there was a lot of focus on, we need to do this one thing, or we need to figure out like, what is the right suite of technologies? We need to bring the cost down and push them out. Or there are people who think we need just the right policy in place. All we need is a price on carbon, or maybe not all we need, but the primary thing, so there's been a lot of sort of, I think, single-minded pushing for various elements of what exists within the system. And I think there's starting to be a much bigger recognition that while there's obviously those pieces are important, any one of those happening successfully doesn't guarantee success in terms of deployed greenhouse gas reducing infrastructure at climate scale. And so what you need is not only the technologies pushed out and coming down the cost curve, not only the policy that's going to recognize that in most cases doing things in a carbon-free manner is more expensive than doing them in a traditional fossil-intensive manner. Not only do you need all the people willing to finance this, and in some case taking some risks that are different from previous ones that they've looked at, all of these things need to add up together, and they need to happen at the same time in order for this to make a difference. And so again, I think what's really great is that we are really starting to recognize this. And so there are entities, there are philanthropists, there are a lot of people who are looking at different pieces of the system and saying, oh, I see this thing is missing, and going after it. And so I think we have a much better chance of moving quickly now than we ever have. And this is what I'm really hoping to see and to ramp up, is more of this big picture thinking, and hopefully our piece of this, which is to bring innovation to some of the systems level challenges that we have there, and that this is going to mean that we get where we need to go much more quickly than we would have otherwise.
Phenomenal. I think that the go quickly but go together aspect is so important. We're getting another question that I'd like to squeeze in, time willing. The audience member asked, you talked about equity and the need to make sure climate solutions have an equal effect on all populations, including those who are not easily hurt by policymaker. How do you reach those populations to learn what their needs are? So I think that's a really great question when we talk about inclusion in this space.
Oh my gosh, that is a really good question. And to be totally honest, this is actually exactly what we're wrestling with right now. So I think, there are a number of different things. There are definitely community organizations that are thinking very directly about climate and equity issues and impacts. And so obviously we're hoping to have conversations with those kinds of organizations, particularly as they relate to specific programs that we want to pursue. But I think one of the most important things that is incumbent on us to do is to listen to all kinds of community organizations, not just about what matters to these populations in terms of climate, but what matters generally. What are the really important near-term needs? Because I don't think it's okay for us to come in and say, we want to have all these conversations about climate and justice if that's really not the problem for these communities. There's so many other things related to jobs, to health, to, near-term pollution impacts. And I think it's incumbent on us to really understand, what are those really big issues that they're facing right now and that are, and that need to get solved. And then to think about, sure, are there places that these bigger issues of climate change kind of flange up with those things? But we have to be really careful about that. So I think it's talking to community organizations. It's talking to people who think with respect to these community organizations that exist within the climate tech and innovation ecosystem. I think it's talking to real people, and ideally our goal is not just to talk to them, it's also to do two things. One is to compensate them for their time when they do, which is historically not something that we've done. And the other is to not just talk, but to bring them in, to fund them as actual participants within our programs, to be doing the design work and in the belly of the beast with the scientists, with the people who are going to be running experiments, or doing, policy or market design or whatever it is. To make sure that there's actually meaningful connection here and that these communities not only have a voice, but they have a role in actually defining what these climate tech outcomes are going to be. That's our goal. But again, I'm early in this journey and really eager to learn about the most effective ways to do that.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, we're getting close to the end of our session. Lara, thank you so much. In the last 15 seconds, I just wanted to ask you, the Thanksgiving holiday is coming up. What are you thankful for, climate or otherwise?
Oh, that's a great question. I have so many things to be thankful for. I'm first and foremost thankful for my family because they're just awesome and wonderful. And despite the fact that I've spent way too much time with them over the last year and a half, I still adore them and I'm very thankful for them. Second, I will say, honestly, I'm really thankful for networks like yours and for the people who are doing this work. I feel so fortunate every day to be part of a community of people with so much drive, who care so much about really having impact. I really think it's so fun to be able to work with people who are driven by passion and who want to solve a problem together. And then, man, I think the last thing I'll say is that I'm thankful for this moment. I'm both daunted and scared, I think, as anyone is who is watching what's happening with the climate right now. But I'm thankful that there seems to be this really big wave of momentum, not just among the folks who, live and breathe climate and climate tech and innovation and policy work all day, but also everyone else around the planet. So really hoping that we can harness that really productively and really do a lot to make sure that we keep our planet livable.
Absolutely. I think we're all thankful for everything that you mentioned. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to have this conversation with Lara, for the entire NSPN community. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back now to Janelle to tell us what to expect going forward. Have a great day, all. Thanks,
Amrita. And thank you, Janelle. This has been wonderful.
Sure. Thank you so much, Lara. And thank you, Amrita, for moderating. This was an excellent panel. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to throw my slides back on real quick just to give a couple updates and share some information about the next panels. So the next two panels that are coming up at 1 o'clock Eastern time are utilizing energy democracy to build community capacity and voice. So if you want to attend that panel, you'll stay in this Zoom room. And then the other panel that you can access through the Sketch links is Water Rights and Wrongs. Let me see what's the rest of it. Managing Resources and Knowledge in a Changing Climate. So just a note that many of our workshop sessions are filling up or are full at this point. So please check through your Sketch and remember to update your schedules if any of your plans have changed, so that folks on the waitlist can get in if you've decided not to attend something or switched or something like that. We'll also be checking to see who has joined the Zoom a few minutes into the presentations after they start. And so if you're on the wait list, keep an eye on your email. We're likely to open up some more spots if people don't show up, etc. So we now have a 15-minute break, and I want to encourage all of you to take our survey. So this is the annual NSPN member survey, and this helps us improve our programs and sort of refine things to make sure we're meeting the needs of our members. So if you're a new member, or if you've been a member for the entire history of NSPN, we'd love for you to take that survey. So it takes about 10-15 minutes, and yeah, you can head over in the link